Wolfen. I'm the director, and it's my pleasure to host this meeting here today on a post-Brexit agreement for research and innovation. So this week is obviously Brexit week. As you all know, we think there is a lot of things that will be discussed this week and of course will be discussed in the coming months. And the focus, in a sense, is now shifting away from looking at the Brexit itself, but rather looking at the future relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom. And to support reflections on this future relation, Bruegel has decided to do a joint project with Wellcome Trust, which is based in the UK, and has supported this project also financially. And what we've done in the last couple of months is we've actually done a simulated negotiation for a post-Brexit agreement on research and innovation. So this is quite an innovation in the sense that the report that you have now in front of you is not a report that was written just in front of a computer, sitting and doing some background research. It is really a report that summarizes an actual negotiation process of two teams, one from the UK, one from the EU, on the future science and research and innovation relationship. And I think as we will hear in a few minutes, I think this process actually revealed that it's not that trivial to come to a close relation and to come to an agreement very easily. I mean, there's many pitfalls in these kind of negotiations, and I think part of the sort of the value of this project has really been about understanding the project and understanding the difficulty of negotiations on the future relation. I guess it's also a sign that it might be optimistic and might be difficult to reach a full-blown and comprehensive agreement on the future relation between the EU and the UK in the next 11 months. I think there's a lot of optimism here if we think we can achieve that. And I guess what this report shows that even in a small dimension such as research and innovation, there's lots of things one has to take into account. I'm particularly grateful today to the lead authors, the lead people that led this project. First, Sir Michael Lee is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Bologna, and he has been the negotiation facilitator, so he's been negotiating and making sure that the negotiations actually lead to some outcome. And I would like to thank Beth Thompson from the UK. She has led the UK team, and Reinhilde Voiglers unfortunately couldn't make it today. Reinhilde Voiglers is a senior fellow at Bruegel, and she has led the EU team. And then there's been lots of people on both sides of the channel providing input into this project, and I really would like to thank them as well. I think I covered it all. I want to thank, of course, all the project managers, Scarlett Wager, Pauline Chitay, and on the UK side, Martin Smith and Simon Hall, for making sure that this project actually became a reality. And I think we will hear first the presentation of the project by Sir Michael, then a keynote speech by Jaroslav Pietras, Director General at the Council of the European Union. And following that, we will have a panel discussion. And let me announce that in the panel discussion, we are grateful that Gina Dowding agreed to participate. I think very last minute you agreed to jump in. We had Philip Lamberts first in the program, and unfortunately he couldn't make it anymore, so it's great to have you today also. Thank you very much for coming, and of course Claire Moody, former member of the European Parliament, will also participate, and André Sapir, senior fellow at Bruegel, will participate in that panel debate, and he's been also interacting on this project and participating on this project. So thank you all for making this project happen. It's an awkward week for Europe. It's an important week because the EU leaves the EU institutions. It doesn't leave the single market yet, but it leaves the EU institutions as of 1st of February. And we don't know yet how it will look like in 11 months. Part of the relation is also about research and development and science and innovation, where we all typically would benefit from working together. But how much we can work together depends on negotiations. And Sir Michael, I think, will introduce us to the outcome of this negotiation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Thanks for organising this very interesting initiative and for your invitation to me to facilitate the exercise. Thanks to everyone for coming here on a rather difficult day. I'm spending a lot of my time in Bologna, where you know the political movement that's had quite an influence on the outcome of the election in Emilia-Romagna is known as the Sardines. I can tell you I felt like that on the tram on Avenue Louise this morning. I know what it feels like to be a sardine. So thanks very much, despite these difficulties, for being here this morning. I would just add one piece of information to what Guntram presented, and that is that our keynote address by Jaroslav Pietras will be heard both here and in London. So at the end of this presentation, short presentation that I'll be giving, we'll connect to the Wellcome Trust in London, and the next item on the agenda will be in common with an audience in London. As you've heard, today we are launching the report of a simulated negotiation between the UK and the EU for an agreement on cooperation on science, innovation and research after Brexit. This project, as you've gathered, was run by Bruegel and the Wellcome Trust in London. In working together on this project, the organisers sought to find ways to preserve the benefits from such cooperation after Brexit. Just to say a few words about these benefits, which have been felt across a wide range of fields, including cancer treatment and food security, as well as safe, clean and efficient energy, and a range of other fields that have been supported through Horizon 2020 and which will evolve under the Future Horizon Europe. Such cooperation is also widely seen as strengthening our economic competitiveness at a time when research and technology are powering ahead across the globe. Indeed, science cooperation is generally viewed as a win-win process for the UK and its EU partners, as can be seen through a few basic figures. The UK's top 10 research partner countries are in Europe. Similarly, the UK is a significant research partner for many EU countries, so the benefits really are reciprocal. For example, co-authored papers with UK-based authors represent more than 10% of the research output of the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, Denmark, and Ireland. So there really are concrete benefits from working together. In Horizon 2020, the EU's current framework programme for research and innovation, the UK is one of the top 5 research partners for almost every member state. So there are significant mutual interests at stake in finding ways to continue cooperation after Brexit. Our simulation involved a negotiation taking place after Brexit. It was projected into the future with a scenario which assumed, correctly as it turned out, that the UK would have left early in 2020 on the basis of a withdrawal agreement, something which was far from certain when the project was launched. It was intended to produce an agreement on continued science cooperation through association of the UK after Brexit with the EU's next framework programme, Horizon Europe, that is expected to start in January next year. The exercise drew on techniques developed through simulations held in academic settings in recent years. It was the fourth such simulation that I've been involved with personally, and it drew on the lessons of a number of earlier simulations on related but different subjects. To some degree, it reflected real-world negotiations in seeking a balanced agreement in which both sides, acting on the basis of mutual interest, moved beyond their initial red lines to reach compromise solutions. The negotiators followed the well-known principle, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So there was a complex process in which concessions in one area were balanced against concessions by the other side in other areas. For practical reasons, though, differing from the real-world situation, the exercise was compressed into 3 relatively short negotiating sessions in Brussels and London, and focused on a limited number of central controversial issues. So it didn't cover the whole range of science cooperation, but focused on the conditions necessary for the UK to be associated with Horizon Europe in the future, and in particular the thorny issues that presented. Certain important related matters, such as participation in the Erasmus programme or in Euratom, were not addressed in this process. The text, which is included in the report that's available to you this morning, takes the form of a classic EU agreement, and it's inspired by agreements with other countries, providing for their association with the EU's framework programmes, adapted to the particular circumstances of post-Brexit Britain and the EU. The text was reviewed by distinguished legal experts on both sides of the channel. It's put forward as a demonstration of what can be achieved with the necessary political will and in a spirit of compromise, rather than as a text which the organisers recommend for adoption in its present form. So it's cast in legal terms, it's been checked by legal experts, it takes the form of a classic EU agreement, but the purpose is not in saying, take this agreement lock, stock and barrel as the basis for the future. It's meant as a demonstration. And clearly in the real world, there'll be a complex negotiation bringing in other factors. So it's meant as a demonstration of what is feasible and possible with the necessary political will, not necessarily to be followed word by word. The simulation involved 2 negotiating teams representing the UK and the EU. As Guntram has said, the EU team was led by Reinhilde Vogelers, Senior Fellow here at Bruegel and Professor at KU Leuven. The UK team was led by Beth Thompson, from whom we'll be hearing briefly shortly, Head of UK and EU Policy at the Wellcome Trust in London. The teams consisted of scientists, researchers, academics, science policy experts, former senior officials, and a member of the last European Parliament, Claire Moody, who is here with us this morning. Participants took responsibility for different issue areas in the negotiations, but they did not simulate or mimic the role of specific real-world actors. So there was nobody playing the role of the European Commissioner or of a British minister. They were playing functional roles dealing with specific issue areas in the negotiations. The report that is available to you sets out in detail how the simulation was run, and we can perhaps come to some of these issues in the panel discussion subsequently. Many difficult issues were addressed in the course of the negotiation. To begin with, the very principle of association itself as distinct from more limited third country participation. This was an issue that was not self-evident at the beginning of the negotiations. The UK's financial contribution obviously also gave rise to complex discussions. Other issues that were the focus of the negotiations included data protection, technical standards, the decision-making process that would apply to the future participation of the UK in the framework programme, the question of the mobility of scientists and their families, as well as the rights of family members to work when they accompany a participant, a beneficiary of a grant, and the dispute settlement process, all of which you can see touched on red lines that have been established publicly by both sides in discussions until now. The negotiators took their roles seriously and were tough on issues where they knew that there were certain political constraints. At the same time, one must acknowledge, as most of the negotiators were with a scientific background, they were researchers, they were science policy people, they were, of course, disposed to reach an agreement, which they did in the course of 3 negotiating rounds. The project delivers a number of messages. The main takeaway is that continued cooperation between the UK and the EU on science, research and innovation is both desirable and feasible. The obstacles to the conclusion of an agreement in this vital field can be overcome with political vision and a spirit of compromise. The issue needs to be addressed early in the forthcoming UK-EU negotiations in order not to lose continuity in these vital fields. There was considerable concern of the risk that if the basis for the UK's participation in Horizon Europe had not been clarified, if not finalized, by the end of the transition period and by the time that Horizon Europe becomes effective in January next year, a gap could appear, and lost habits of cooperation could then mean a further decline in the number of cooperative projects. I must say I've discussed this point to some extent subsequently and have received some reassurance in the sense that it's not expected that the first calls for Horizon Europe will be made until quite late in 2021, so that there will be a little more time than simply the end of this year before these issues need to be resolved and a solid basis found for the EU's future participation. Clearly, a simulation, however realistic in some respects and however instructive, is one thing, and real-world negotiations are another. In the real world, political leaders will want to see agreement on the EU's future budget, the multi-annual financial framework, the famous MFF, of which Horizon Europe will be a part, before signing off on a science agreement, however beneficial it may be. The preference shown by the negotiators in our exercise was for a standalone science agreement because there was a concern that it would take a longer time before the bigger picture is clear. In the real world, it seems relatively unlikely that the main actors will be ready to envisage a standalone agreement before there is clarification about the overall framework for future UK-EU relations. However, a break in continuity would bring a significant risk of erosion of Europe's competitiveness in science and research and its commercial application. Already the number of new European joint projects involving the EU has fallen alarmingly, and for this reason, both sides felt an incentive to reach an agreement. I would conclude on a personal note and simply point out, from my perspective, that a no-deal Brexit at the end of the year or a minimal so-called thin deal Brexit, which covers only limited aspects of trade in goods, with no provision for future cooperation on science and other crucial fields, would deliver a serious blow to economic competitiveness on both sides of the Channel. My strong impression is that neither party at this stage wants such an outcome and will work to prevent it. And I'm confident that in the discussions that will get underway next year, there will be a focus not only on the core provisions of a future agreement dealing with trade, but also a framework for cooperation in this and other fields. As Brexit becomes a reality this Friday, we hope that the successful outcome of our simulation will encourage real-world negotiators to start work without delay and may even give them some useful pointers. Thank you very much. I look to Pauline. I think we'll have a very brief pause now and we'll connect shortly with London. Is that the case, Pauline? Okay. Just a few moments' patience, please. As we have a few moments, I mean, if you glance at the report, the executive summary really brings out the main points. They're developed in much further detail later on, but if you read through the executive summary, you will get a strong sense of the main points in the outcome of the negotiations. It was a few minutes, yes, I was told that I should finish by 5 too, so I mean, I finished a little bit early. They want to connect at 5 minutes too. I'm a very obedient type. I was taught that succinctness was the... Good morning, Beth. Can you hear us? Not yet.
They can't hear us in Brussels.
We can hear you now, Beth. Can you hear us?
We can hear you now, Beth. Ah, wonderful. Well, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Wonderful to be with you, Brussels. Michael, thank you. Thank you for hosting this session and for your work pulling together the report with us. We're from the wonderful Francis Crick Institute in London, which is right next door to the Eurostar station. So we feel it's a very appropriate place to be. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you very much, Beth.
This morning, presented the project in broad terms, and we're looking forward to more detailed discussions later in the day. We're going to begin.
Michael, we have some problems hearing you.
Okay, let's see whether technical support can re-establish the sound. Can you hear me now? Yes? I've lost you now. This is the story of life, isn't it? Okay, fine. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Jaroslav Pietras, who is Director General in the Secretariat of the Council of Ministers of the European Union here in Brussels, and who is going to share with us his somewhat broader reflections to get us going in our discussions this morning. So, Jaroslav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. I have been asked earlier and also this morning by Michael to give a kind of a reality check. And to give a reality check, I have to be sure that I'm on a safe side. And I'm quite reassured and feel safer when colleagues some of them are in London, not in an immediate proximity, because then I could tell a bit more freely what could be a reality check. The first thing that I have to make is obviously a reservation. I'm dealing with ministers for education, for energy, transport, number of ministers meeting in a council to decide on issues. However, the issue of Brexit has been taken out of the sectoral ministers for a very good reasons, because we are all facing kind of a psychological shock. It means we think things until now were so good, why to change it? And whereas things are going to change. Therefore, the negotiations has been taken to a special group and also are taken not by sectoral ministers, but by foreign ministers, by Sherpas, by heads of state and their collaborators. So it's a totally different stream. And they even are separated from the rest of the Council Secretariat by the doors which are locked, secure elements of dealing with papers and so on. Even, as you perfectly know, everything which is confidential is of a great interest and therefore is much easier circulated. So I know a bit about what is being discussed over there. But if you think that you could give me the text of the agreement and I will put it into practice, it's a wrong address. It's not me that will deal with the text afterwards. However, obviously with the knowledge, with the observation that I have, probably I could give you some assessment where there's a bit more problem and where is less problem. Anyhow, everything is within the context of the larger process, and it has to be understood this way. And we are speaking about a specific segment of our relationships where the both sides can benefit from collaboration, but it also is a segment which is very important in various terms, not only contribution to science and development, not only to competitiveness of any economy in Europe, but also it is sizable in terms of money involved. And when you look at the overall budget for development of innovations and research, these are large part of the European budget. And if you look at what was the contribution from the EU budget to British project under this existing still Horizon 2020, it is in billions, it's around 6 billion. So it is not a negligible amount of money. And therefore I think it is right to look at this process, also to see how these important elements can be arranged after Brexit. But this is not something which is small. It is a sizable component of our future relationships. So I think with the Brexit, which is now approaching in terms of hours, we have to have imagination, we have to have a determination, but also see what is a possibility to find arrangement for our future relationships, because it relates to a significant, very important components of our cooperation. However, from a process point of view, it has always been taken in a larger context. So there will be a political context related to agreement in area which looks, which is very dear to, I think, to all of those who are here, and also all who are those over there. But these elements are in the context of other problems, also conflicting, where the understanding is maybe a bit less clear. And therefore, one has to see to which extent it can be a standalone project or agreement. And here, Michael has said that it is difficult to imagine that in a real world, it can be so evidently assured that it will be a standalone project. Even if it would be a standalone agreement, it always be discussed in the context of other problems. So it doesn't, it's not a question of a form, it's a question of a context which will be very important. One also have to see that for both sides, there are elements which are important in terms not only on number of projects or in terms of money, but also people involved. And first, maybe it's always good to look to the figures, and the figures of how many projects has been put forward, how much money has been spent and engaged from both sides, and how many people are working on both sides. I mean, as I read in a recent data in academia in UK, there are around 14% on non-UK EU citizens working. So it is a sizable amount of cooperation until now, and these elements will obviously affect it. There is another element, another aspect. We are discussing here research and innovation, but research and innovation is not only Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe. There are more initiatives. And obviously, once you discuss this issue, you have to look at other forms of cooperation or other places where both EU and UK money, researchers, institutions are being engaged. And here, for example, we've got some other things like Galileo, where there is, which is based on a different legal basis. There are a number of other projects which are either financed by Horizon money or they are established separately. And they deal with many collaborative projects which go beyond EU member states. So like Galileo, for example, or Joint Research Center. So therefore, one has to look not only at a standalone project dealing with Horizon Europe for next year, but has to look what will be the repercussions, what will be the impact, what would be the example that will be taken when discussing participation in these other elements. I think we are all taken by desire to continue like it was. However, things will be different. And then you have to have a bit of imagination how it can be different. And I sense few elements of problems in various contexts. Let's go of some as in a report is being also enumerated. When you look at the formal framework, it is very difficult, as I already have said, it's very difficult to imagine participation in this area without having a proper framework for everything that relates to our bilateral relationships. So it is a question whether this will be finished by end of this year, because then there is a chance that we will also finish by addressing the issues related to innovation and research. But what happens if our future relationships are not finished? Michael has been saying, what happens if there is only few elements of a trade, or tariffs, and small and moving goods across the frontiers? And if many other things are not settled, are not properly arranged, formally established, then it will be a bit more difficult to see that we will come quickly to this issue. So it is, even if you look at the goods, if goods cannot circulate freely, then you've got a problem of research, which very often has got a format in a final stage of things that have to flow between the countries. Even for research, where you need very often equipment that you move that way or another way, and this will might be affected. So here, for formal framework, I see in a real life, a bit of danger that we will not be, it would be much better to have everything at once by the foreseen date, and then it would be ensured. Then there's a question of financial contribution. So we have to go from a current system to a new one. But the new one, what is a new one? I mean, when you are a negotiator, what you do, and I'm not a negotiator here, so please do not take my words as someone that is negotiating, but what you do, you look at the examples of similar situations. And here we've got two examples of associated countries or third countries. And there has been some precedences, how it was organized. Obviously, you could be innovative. You could find another form. However, this another form will immediately become a standard. So negotiators will look what is the implication, not for EU-UK relationships, but for anyone else in being involved. And then it is, one has to also see that in the context of money, it is a larger context. Spending public money in Europe is always a difficult issue. Michael has mentioned the financial perspective. I have been involved in negotiating some of them, at least one very fully, with the British that have finalized it, and it was the British presidency that have finalized this one. And I understand how difficult it is and what are the motives for establishing certain figures. And when you look at the money which are devoted to research and innovation, they have not been taken out of blue. They have been taken into consideration other elements. For example, that there are countries which are net contributors. They've got a little chance to recuperate some of the money. And therefore, you create the programs which, by definition, provide a chance to these countries to get engaged with the EU budget in a considerable manner. So you see that the money for research and innovation have been also in this context of large contributors. It's totally different context than when you look at someone who is associated or a third party. It's a different considerations. And then when you look at the current perspective, I think leaders will look how this should be constructed. They obviously will look where money should go. They will look at the topics and issues that they want to spend. spend, they will have to spend money on some issues, even they don't not really like continuing spending on it. But this also will be under consideration. So, and the contributions will be also looked upon from this point of view. So I think here there is a bit more additional complications, because finances here cannot be agreed before EU is making mind on the internal budget, but also before EU is looking how new relationships and new principles will play in a system. And you have to also see what is the perception. The perception of the UK take from the Horizon 2020, from the research program, was always seen in a net payer position of UK. So I cannot imagine that here it would be seen a bit differently. It means I cannot imagine that the UK will contribute less than it benefits. Well, when you look into data, when you look into what associated countries are contributing, they have contributed, from the data they have found, it was 6.9%. So it is a smaller size. But they have benefited 6.6%. So it means that they contributed more than they have benefited. When you look at the third countries, they have contributed 1.9%, and they have benefited 0.6%. In financial flows, I think the benefits are obviously much greater. Benefits relates to achievements that you could have, and involvement, interaction between researchers, dissemination of innovation, and so on. But in financial terms, this is something that will be taken into account. The third element, which I sense a bit difficult, is a decision-making process. You've got EU and associated countries and third parties. So decision-making process is not only voting. I'm quite many years working for the Council, and voting at the Council is very seldom. We have on our tablets a special voting calculator, which when you put countries, it gives you whether there is a majority or there is no majority. This is being used by me frequently, but it's never being told. It means you work trying to get a consensus, and you know that if there is a majority, overwhelming majority, then the decision can be easily taken. So very seldom in a room, you've got a discussion about the voting. And here, there is a much more difficult element. Are countries who are associated, or third parties, or UK in this case, are able to take part in all the debate leading to decision-making, and just not taking part in decision-making? If there is no moment that is clear for decision-making, it creates a bit of a feeling you are exactly like everyone else in the decision-making process. Because decision-making process is not only about participating in voting, but is participating in a discussion, participating in evaluation, participating in side meetings, networking. All those things contribute to taking decisions. And here you've got another element, which I would say in a certain manner can be helpful to say, okay, this is something that we have to take into account. If you say in a current horizon, the associated countries have contributed above 6% of the budget, if you would imagine that a similar position would be by UK, the contribution of the associated countries is much larger. And then the question appears, well, with a large participation of associated countries, you have to find also ways how this is being how this is being taken in the decision-making process. It doesn't mean that you give a voting rights, but it is a way how to compensate for the fact that you contribute substantially to the budget and you are still associated countries. So I think, again, this is a quite complex issue. Probably reality check is more difficult. Then movement of research and the families. I think here there is a problem that has been also very well described in a report, that it depends on the legislation which would be in place in the UK. And I can imagine that this legislation in place, it would be much easier if there is an overall legislation, overall agreement reached on the movement of people and the status of those who are already over there. And if this is being agreed, then I can imagine that it is much easier for UK authorities to come with a legislation which would regulate this specific aspect. So here I think it's difficult to see how this is would be solved without overall understanding, at least, or if not agreement. Then issue which is by far more difficult than people tend to think is a question of regulatory standards and regulatory adequacy. At the beginning, it might not be so difficult problem. Why? Because we are not diverging in standards, we are not diverging in various regulatory approaches to research, but also to industrial production. Because if innovations are being put into practice, then have to lead to something which is, for example, accepted everywhere. If you are making research using materials or technologies which are forbidden in other parts, you wonder why you should finance that from the common project, because it will not be applied in one or the other part. So for the beginning, it's not a big issue and can be easily or not fully understood. But in the long run, it would be a much more significant issue. And again, without overall agreement here, it might be difficult to imagine that this kind of adequacy would not be taken into account. So I think here, this norm, standards, level of protection of consumers, level of protection of environment, all these elements will play a role, and including, and that's another point that is somehow well elaborated in a report, is the data protection. Because when you look at what happens in innovation, many of these innovations relate to digital economy, to digital part, where data is a new oil. And when you've got a data, and the question of adequacy of data protection, and this would allow for a free movement of data. Without that, we will have a difficulty to have a movement of data. So here again, there might be some problems, and also relationship to overall agreement. The final question about the process is what is about the process. It means how it can be arrived. And I think if it would depend on the people who were on the project, the negotiating and so on, I think we could arrive it very quickly and very successfully. Generally, if this would be done by the people who are responsible for these issues, either in the Commission, in a country, in the Parliament, this would be also done quite quickly. The process, however, will be a political. And we could have a totally different somehow phase or some dynamics of the overall negotiations. We could arrive at a compromise when everything is agreed. But before, there might be a number of tensions, and then it will be difficult to find agreement. The major problem is that when I was reading this project, I have found plenty of collaborative approaches. So the approach applied by both sides was to collaborate, to find a way how to cope with a difficult issue. It means we have been sympathetic to each other. And then, because there is an understanding of commonality and mutuality of interests. However, the political process overall can also be a bit of confrontational. There are moments that might be tariffs imposed on products which are punitive, or there might be some other things. Obviously, I would like to see that whole the process is much more collaborative, that we arrive at the outcome which is beneficial for both sides. But how we arrived is also quite important. And I have found a quotation from someone saying what should be the outcome. And because this person has got a lot of influence on the process, when he was saying that it should be singing and dancing flow of goods, I think it should be not limited only to goods, but also to all the elements related to research and innovation. Michael, should I stay?
I think we have two questions foreseen, two from London. I think we have two questions foreseen now from London and two questions to be posed here in Brussels. Are we set from a technical point of view? Hear the questions from London. Perhaps we'll begin with anyone here might like to pose while we get the... Let's begin with any questions. Is there anyone in the audience here? Anyone in the audience here who would like to pose a question? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thomas Jørgensen from the European University Association. I think this was a very interesting thing to glance through this morning. And the whole idea about a research agreement and what you say is going to latch on to so many other processes. But my question is a research agreement on the table? To my knowledge, what is on the table is the general principle for UK participation in EU programs. And that's basically what's on the table for the next months. Implicitly in that is that there should be associations to EU programs, because otherwise why would you have the general principles? And those general principles might or would have some amount of reciprocity. But the holistic research agreement is something that was on the British table some time ago. I haven't heard about it for a long time. And I actually haven't heard about it from the EU side, but I might be wrong here.
I think you are right to put this element on the table, because this project is somehow to contribute to thinking that you need not only a very small sized approach to participation of the UK. You need something more, because otherwise many ties will be interrupted. By producing this report, including the text of the agreement, you provide with the answers to questions. You provide first the questions and the answers to questions. And it's up to negotiators to pick them up. I said at the beginning, I'm not a negotiator here. I look at what is possible, what is not possible. Having an agreement within the whole system requires an approach which involves all the elements. And for the time being, we are trying to define the framework for the whole. And what I have seen is that there is a thinking about addressing all the issues. the form it will be addressed might be a bit different. But the issue of research and innovation is a question for the negotiations. What is the form that it will be finalized? I cannot tell you, and I don't know, because it depends on negotiators, what they will think attractive to solve. But the issue of research and innovation participation is obviously among the elements that have been discussed by the working party that deals with that. So it's a question of a form and the content.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. I was interested in your numbers about third countries. Contribution 1.9, benefit 0.6. Do you agree that it will be very difficult for the United Kingdom to agree to such a model?
Oh, but I have said about associated countries as well. And then associated countries, it is 6.9 versus 6.6. So the difference is just minimal. And when you look at the report, it says something which is very clear. It is related to the past results, past outcome of the UK receipts, and the contributions are also to make up additional administrative costs, which might be somehow added to that. So I cannot imagine, therefore, that the contributions by the UK could be smaller than the benefits that UK had. If this is not imaginable for the UK, that would be probably the end of the discussion. However, the proportions for the third countries is something different, because you are talking about small amounts and small projects, and then the outcome may be different in different years. And also, there is a benefit of being linked to larger projects where you contribute a lot, but you gain in a non-financial terms. What we are speaking here is just a pure financial terms, whereas for third parties, sometimes these non-financial benefits are far more greater.
There will be other opportunities to pose questions to Jaroslav during the panel discussion, but shall we see now whether we are able technically to take the questions from London?
Hello, I think we're back to London. Can you hear us in Brussels?
Yes, Beth. Do you have some questions in London?
We do. Thank you very much for your keynote talk. That was fascinating. I'm going to combine some of the questions we have here into just one question before we move on to the panel. So we've seen the EU task force slides, which suggest there will be two negotiating pillars on trade and on security. So people here are expressing concern that research and innovation could fall through the gaps between those two pillars. And can you tell us, therefore, do you think the political will can be found to fix this? And do you think, where do you think the hopes and the real hope is for finding that political will?
Yes. Look, political will is something which is very difficult to define. And also political will depends on the circumstances that might happen that we don't even see at this moment. But I think at this moment, on both sides, and at least what I have seen on the EU side, there is a will to address all the issues which are related to something which is mutually beneficial, where both sides have got significant interest. And, it depends a bit how this process will run. But at this moment, I have what I could see, what I could hear from my colleagues, is that all the issues can be discussed. However, the two issues are the most political, and they will be setting the scene. One issue is the trade, because trade will affect hugely economy of the EU member states and also UK. So the trade issues have to be treated as a priority. And the second is where both sides have got a huge interest is a question of security and whatever relates to that. But there are a number of other issues, and for example, in aviation, in energy, where you have to have linkages which cannot be interrupted. And all those elements will be discussed. The question is whether they will be discussed before or during, in parallel, or after major issues will be solved. So you could imagine that you've got an agreement on the major political issues, and then you come, okay, now we have to solve remaining outstanding problems because there are many. I mean, again, the most rational approach would be to look where we could have a mutually benefiting relationships and what kind of arrangements. If this is a collaborative process, this would happen. However, if there will be a bit of tension on the major issues, probably this would, the political will concentrate on most political burning problems. And that's how things may go in a real life.
Thank you very much. I think that will end our time together on the live link up. It's been really wonderful to join up with you, Brussels. So from all our audience here and from me and the Wellcome team, thank you very much to Bruegel and thank you to all of you there. Au revoir.
Well, thank you very much, Beth, and thank you especially to Jaroslav for raising all those extremely realistic and telling points. We now have an opportunity to continue the discussion in the panel format, so I would invite the panelists to come and join me here on the platform. I've asked them all to make very short comments so that we will have sufficient time for discussion and questions. So please, would you like to come and join us? So we're very pleased now to continue our discussion with four panelists who are very familiar with these issues and will be able to go into further detail and to respond to your questions. And we'll begin with Claire Moody, who was one of the participants in the exercise and who was until last year a member of the European Parliament. What was your constituency?
The southwest of England.
For the southwest of England. And who played a very active part in the discussions. So Claire, for 7 or 8 minutes, could I give you the floor?
Thank you, Michael. And I want to start by saying that it was both a privilege and a very interesting exercise to take part in. And it is also one that was very, very dear to my heart. I worked on the research programme when I was a member of the European Parliament. I had in my region, well, I still have in my region, a number of institutions that were heavily involved in and benefited hugely from the research programme. And, of course, all the citizens I represented also benefited enormously from the outcome of the research programmes that have been involved. When it comes to the report and the agreement that we've pulled together, there are a few points that I just want to highlight. Firstly, I'm very glad that we are doing this launch event this week, because it is enormously timely. We know now, which we didn't know, as Michael said earlier, when we were negotiating this, we do know now that the UK is leaving the European Union at the end of this week. But we also know that's the beginning of a process of talks and negotiations that are going to go on. And exactly has been said is that this is going to be a detailed set of negotiations. But I have not heard enough yet around the fact that these negotiations have to include our research and science and innovation, collaboration and cooperation. So I'm pleased that we are now able to highlight this issue and to raise this issue. Secondly, again, as has already been said, going through this negotiation process and to deliver an agreement absolutely highlighted the points that have been made in terms of the difficulties. And the money, the people, the regulatory issues, the data issues, all of these were issues that we deliberately explored to get to an agreement. And yes, these are difficult issues in however the future arrangement is framed. But what we also wanted to do through this, and I think delivered in the outcome of this project, is the fact that difficult though they may be, they are soluble and we can reach an agreement. And this is in itself a piece of work that I hope can be used by the negotiators, but it is also an example that can be used by the negotiators of how we can get through these difficult negotiations and this period too. So I hope we stand as that example to others. Thirdly, I, as you can only imagine, have had countless meetings, negotiations, discussions, one-to-one, large groups, etc., related to all things Brexit. More than I would ever have wanted to have had. But the reality is that the one set of people, the one group of people that I have worked with over the last years that have been most united in understanding the benefit of the common endeavour that we have achieved as UK, European Union, has been this research, science and innovation community. There is a will and a drive within the community to build on the work that has been done through Horizon 2020, but also very importantly through those kind of connected programmes as well. And what I hope that this agreement and the related report can do too is also act as a kind of focal point and again a drive that we have to continue to support that collaboration and cooperation beyond this date of 31st of January and the event of Brexit. Fourthly, and you'll be pleased to know, Michael, finally, there is also the European Union process that is going on. A lot of work has already been done on the Horizon Europe regulation. A lot of work is already agreed on the Horizon Europe regulation. The element of third country involvement clearly is still open. But there is a timeline associated with that agreement as well as with the Brexit negotiations. And again, what I hope this can do is be used in the EU 27 as part of where we could get to, recognising that the regulation is for all associated countries, but that at least there must be that space left in that regulation for all of us to work as effectively as possible in delivering for all of our citizens, and understanding that the EU 27's priority is obviously for the EU 27 citizens, but that this is a mutual benefit where we get more than the sum of our parts if we collaborate and we cooperate. So, in conclusion, please do read the agreement. Please do read the associated report. I know, having been to a lot of these things, you pick up the document, you have the best of intentions, and then other things happen. But I urge you to look at it in detail. But also to repeat the point that this is not a topic that is being talked about enough in terms of those future negotiations. So it is up to us to raise our voices, and it is up to us to keep making the point that we not only want this agreement, but that actually, in my view, we need to have the arrangements made for all of our citizens. We develop medicines, we develop climate change opportunities, we develop societal change opportunities. All of the pillars identified in Horizon Europe are ones which we can develop and involve if we work together in the future. But we have to make our voices heard. So thank you to Bruegel, thank you to the Wellcome Trust. It's been a privilege to be part of this, and I hope we can build on the work that's been done.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire, and also for your contribution to the exercise. I'd like now to give the floor to Jean Dowding, who is also a member of the European Parliament and has worked extensively on related issues.
Thank you. Firstly, I'm delighted to be here this morning, even though yesterday morning I didn't know that I would be here. And I'm sorry I'm not Philippe Lambert, who has got enormous expertise on the negotiating side in the European Parliament as co-leader of the Greens EFA group. My background since July last year as a new member of the European Parliament representing the northwest of England, my involvement in this issue is I have been the shadow rapporteur for the Green Group on Horizon, on the Horizon file. And I just have to say, wow, I have learned such a lot. I'm not an academic, and I just thought there were maybe some things that I could bring to this discussion from the perspective of what's going on in those negotiations that we haven't gone into detail about this morning. But firstly, I just want to say this is such a huge contribution, and congratulations, well done. I think this is a tremendous example of a model, a way forward, and let's just hope this does get taken up by those people who are going to be in the negotiations. Just to go back to the Horizon file and the things that are being discussed there, the Greens were instrumental in getting that commitment to a 35% of all Horizon funding on climate-related research and innovation, and there's a lot of debate going on about what that means in practice. What is climate-relevant research? And so there's debate on that. There's a lot of debate still about the involvement of citizens, as Claire has said. For this to touch the European public at large, there has to be more effort put into reaching out in the involvements, in the structure of the programmes. And there's a lot of concern about that across parties. And of course, very close to my heart is the role of research and innovation in the implementation of the European Green Deal or the Green New Deal, whether that's in Europe-wide or in the UK or wherever. So those are some of the other issues that are being discussed. I should add, actually, that this is really timely for me because I actually produced my own very small report as a Northwest MEP, What's on the Horizon for UK Science Research and Innovation. It's on my website as of yesterday, ginadowding.org.uk. It goes into nowhere near the depth that you have done, but what I was trying to flag up there was this issue of how do we get the public involved in this discussion? How do we make sure that the negotiators really understand the depth of feeling about the importance of collaboration for research and the importance of research and innovation in solving our global challenges. So that, that wider debate. But one of the things I think that one of the stumbling blocks about the UK's role as associate member, and we've been discussing the figures, or some of the figures have been discussed, is that with the £6 billion contribution, £6 billion involvement from the UK in the current horizon, that's far larger than any other associate member to date. I think the next largest is Switzerland, or I can't remember, but we're talking any other associate member is around £1 billion, I think, not much more than £1 billion. And the UK's contribution has been £6 billion. So that does change that relationship of associate members with and their role in the future negotiations. And the other probably most political issue is, as has been said, we're hoping for rationality, common sense, and a spirit of cooperation in these negotiations. And let's face it, that we do know there is all those other controversial issues are going to be being discussed around the trade deal. What we desperately want not to happen is that research and innovation and any agreement becomes a bargaining chip in those other discussions. And that's, obviously a danger. So that the UK is going to be looking at translating all the current EU legislation into UK legislation through an employment bill, environment bill, agriculture bill. This isn't going to be, the research and innovation is not going to be subject to a specific bill, but all those things are going to be happening. Those things will underpin the trade deal, and it all gets very complicated and messy. And what I think we all want to ensure is that research and innovation doesn't become embroiled in any of those, in any adversarial negotiation tricks, shall we say, and become a bargaining chip. And I think Claire's last plea to you all, which I would echo, is we all need to be pushing for an agreement that can continue that spirit of collaboration and all the huge benefits to both the EU and the UK. And I would say, as a politician, when we talk about we need to involve our citizens more. So, my small report was really about trying to engage the public and people working in universities, not just the leaders in the academic field, to be involved, to understand the absolute importance of research and innovation and the future agreement that we will have from the UK side, the benefits across Europe to all parties. And so I will take that, even though my formal role ends on Friday, I will be doing what I can back in my region in the Northwest with our 5 centres of excellence, including Manchester University, Liverpool and Lancaster, to push this agenda. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you. I'll give the floor now to André Sapir, a senior fellow here at Bruegel, for 7 or 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for leading this project. Thanks for the outcome, and thanks for all the discussion we had already this morning. I just want to look at 2 issues that have already obviously been discussed, and maybe try to add a small dimension. The two facets that we have been discussing throughout this morning are the desirability and the feasibility. I don't think there is much. I'm an economist, I'm a researcher. I've been involved in science and innovation research policies, and also as a scientist. I don't think there is any point much belaboring the point of the desirability, especially in this audience. One can talk about competitiveness, one can talk about the climate challenges in whatever dimension that we are looking of, or not just economies, of our societies. Certainly research and innovation is crucial both to our past and to our future. This is so obvious that I don't want to use much of the time, the short time that is allotted to me to go about. So desirability, obvious. And that, there is a community out here and out there that is giving those points to politicians. It's needed, but it's being done because it's such an obvious matter. So I think we can concentrate on the feasibility. Now, feasibility, it seems to me, there are also two dimensions. One is, let's say, of a technical nature. Okay? And anybody who has been involved in negotiations knows that there are lots of technical work behind it, but we have lots of good technicians, again, on both sides of the channel. So I'm not doubting that the technical matters, some of which are obviously presented in the report, and I think the report makes a very useful contribution on, highlighting some of the matters. Okay. I think those can be also resolved. We have the capability from a technical viewpoint to deal. So the whole thing comes down to politics, right? I mean, that was the message of Jaroslav that I could not endorse more. So let me say 2 or 3 things about the politics. One is to repeat what I think was perhaps, if I understood properly Jaroslav's point, that one cannot obviously separate the discussion on this aspect, however fundamental it is, science and innovation, research and innovation. One cannot, from a political viewpoint, from a negotiating viewpoint, for a future relationship, a future partnership, one cannot obviously dissociate it from the broader matter. And I could not agree more with Jaroslav when he said that in the end it's a question of spirit. How do we approach? Are we approaching this as a matter of trust, and how, this is really the issue. What is the mindset of those who are negotiating? And I think it was very useful that Jaroslav reminded us that he said, well, it's not his councils that are dealing with this. This has gone to, in a sense, a higher level, and this is trivial, and this is, in a sense, good. Ultimately, it's the leaders. Because it's such an important relationship, right? For all kinds of reasons, not just research. Research is just one of the many, many facets of all of this. So yes, so if it's the leaders, what kind of views do the leaders on both sides have, and where is it they want this future relationship to go? So, yes, there are a number of points. There's the issue of the budget, there's the issue of regulation, and all those are extremely well detailed and explained in the report, and I think indeed very useful for the future negotiators. But in a sense, this is for the negotiators, the sectoral negotiators. It doesn't say anything about the leaders. Right? This report, in a sense, yes, it gives the importance, but what kind of framework do the leaders have? Now, I just want to pick one point, which has not been directly addressed, but Jaroslav did address it in some manner, and it struck me as, I think, a very important point, but I want to broaden it a little bit. This is the issue about associated countries. Andrew, you'll be happy. We are talking about the associated country. You have, have written so much and contributed so much to all of these issues. Now, I think what is very interesting from a political viewpoint is that obviously the UK is not just any associated country, assuming that the UK will become an associated country. It's not just any, right? It's not just, number 15 or 21 or whatever in the associated list of countries. It's a very different country. And it's a very different country, I would say, for two reasons. I mean, you and others may add a number of other. One is that it's a departing country, right? The only country that is leaving the EU. It's going to be a former EU country as an associate country that has all kinds of dimensions that I don't need to expand upon, but it's also the largest of all of those countries. It's large in terms of population. It's certainly the largest by far in terms of the size of its economy. So in that viewpoint, it has all kinds of dimensions. And you said, Jaroslav, well, you know, and you were talking there about the process, right? You were explaining, I think, in a very interesting manner, the voting. And you were explaining, you have your little machine on the side, but we are never, or almost never, doing formal voting. Okay, you are computing sort of coalitions, things of that nature, right? But most of this is being done in an informal manner, as you said, you know, during coffee breaks, evening, things like that. This is where agreements are being made, as we know. I mean, this has been the business of Brussels, right? Doing those kind of things. This is the beauty of it. But with the UK, outside of the formal, okay, it's not a member of the EU, it's not in the formal voting, but the UK being added in the other countries that are associated, that are in the corridors, that are discussing and things, there are all kinds of issues that come. And in relationship to that, the last point that I want to make, which I think has not been mentioned, is the process on the future of Europe. Because we, at this point in time, we are not just starting the relationship, the partnership relationship between the UK and the EU. The EU is also launching its process about itself, the future of Europe. And itself, not just itself inward, but itself in relationship, because the future of Europe is not just looking at one's navel, it's also looking at Europe in a context, in a regional and in a global context. And in this regional context, obviously this association, the UK, all of this plays a very, very major role. So I would say impossible also to dissociate this discussion from the other discussion. Now, how all the pieces fit and how the pieces fit in the time frame that we are talking about, that is something that I leave to much wiser and smarter people. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andre, for opening up the discussion, setting it in a much wider context. Well, we've formally come to the end of the morning's proceedings, but I hope that Bruegel will allow us maybe to erode, or if I might say, eat into the lunch period by 10 or 15 minutes in order to take questions that, because of the shortness of time, we may group together. So who would like to pose a question, please? Would you identify yourselves, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Duff, who I was in the Parliament for quite a number of years and represented, amongst other places, Cambridge. So I have a very strong interest in this matter. I also follow the Brexit saga very, very closely, too closely actually. The problem is that an agreement on research is not going to be part of a classical FTA. And so I strongly recommend that scientists push to have a separate agreement, discrete from the FTA negotiations. Perhaps the FTA negotiations are going to go quite well as ideology turns to pragmatism in the course of the next 12 months. It's quite possible that we will get an agreement, but it will not include British participation in the next research and development programs of the EU. I would cling on to the political declaration, which, despite its change under the new Prime Minister, we were able to ensure that the paragraphs on research and development are still in there. And the best of luck to everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We've taken note of those points and we may come back to them after a few more questions. Guntram.
Sorry, I just wanted to add perhaps one point quickly to Andre's points, why the UK is different. I mean, the UK is also different as an association country in this context because, of course, of its universities. I mean, it still hosts several of the world's leading universities and several of the top European universities. And so it seems to me the interest on the European side to have a close association on research with the United Kingdom is actually far bigger than in many other areas because of the quality of the universities. So that's a very practical point. Perhaps one point to Jaroslav, your intervention. I mean, I think one point I think which you pointed out rightly is the spirit of cooperation that was in our negotiation, and I think we could really see it when our scientists on the both sides were sitting on separate sides. We always had to tell them, by the way, you are now on different sides of the negotiation, right? Because they were so much thinking, what is happening? We really want to work together, and I think it's important to understand that for us this exercise was, in a sense, a reality check, and we learned that, well, actually there are things that are much beyond pure research and beyond pure collaboration that we would all like to see as researchers. And just to give you one example, and you mentioned the regulatory issues, the regulatory divergence. Well, in science and research, there is a lot of regulatory questions that are key. I mean, data, you mentioned the data issue, but it's also issues such as animal welfare in clinical tests, right? I mean, who's going to decide on those, and how will we agree if there's different views on the two sides of the channel on animal welfare in such clinical university medical tests? I mean, these are huge issues that are there, and I think what this exercise helped us to understand is really how complex such a negotiation is. Even if you are really willing to achieve something, it's not going to be easy at all to come to an agreement. Thank you.
Thanks for those reminders, Guntram. There's someone at the back who's been waiting to pose a question for some time. Could you just introduce yourself briefly, please?
Thank you very much. Paolo Sospiro, University of Florence, and I'm an economist. Well, I just, in the last 3 years, I tried, to understand what is happening with Brexit. But as far as I can see, it is very difficult to find an agreement when you are diverging, in terms of interest and in terms of, let's say, perspective. So, such as I completely agree with the point that maybe the EU is highly interested, to get an agreement about research and innovation. But on the other hand, probably, the UK is not interested on getting, an agreement in which it has to pay, such an amount of money, which is what is 6 billion or something like this, and generally speaking, the whole, let's say, amount of money that should have to pay the UK, it is about 13 billions to be in the EU. So almost half of the money to be only in the let's say, in one program. So the idea it is that in terms of cost of benefit analysis, it seems very difficult, to find a way to get a point, at least at the beginning. Maybe, in the next 5 years, maybe, but at the beginning, it seems that divorcing, why to get back at the same condition when you can get better? I don't know. I mean, this seems let's say the point.
Thank you. If I might just clarify, I think both in our exercise and in the real world, the assumption is that in the future, financing not only for Britain, but for other associated countries, and perhaps even for member states, will be more based on a kind of pay-as-you-go model in our exercise, accompanied by a compensatory mechanism than the GDP share that has been used until now. And this figure of 6 billion is not a net figure. I mean, the assumption is that in the future, the UK or other non-member states will be just about even in terms of what they've contributed and what they get back. So it's not 6 billion to be contributed net. We just have a time for one or two final questions before I give the floor back to the panel very briefly for closing remarks. Yes.
Thanks. Matt Hind here from National Grid. I guess my question is to British colleagues. There's a widespread agreement that research and development is something that we should cooperate on. There are no benefits here to divergence. There are no benefits to splitting our research relationships. But people who think that aren't in charge of this negotiation. So I guess my question is, have you engaged with the people who are in charge of this, the David Frosts and the Dominic Cummings? Because they're the ones who are going to unblock this, if it's possible to unblock.
Thank you. So the question whether we are engaging with the real-world actors, come back to that. And a final question at the back of the room, please.
My name is Damiani from APRE, the Italian agency for the promotion of European research. In my previous life, I've had experience negotiating several, as a commission official. I should first of all disclose that I was part of this exercise as a member of the group of experts on the European side. In my past, as a commission official, I've negotiated several science and technology agreements and several framework program association agreements. Based on that experience, I think that schematically, one, yes, it would be quite difficult, I believe, to foresee a science and technology agreement or a Horizon Europe association agreement without a hook in a general agreement. But whether or not there is that sort of hook, I think that there will not be. We will not be allowed to have an association agreement unless there is an overall agreement already achieved between the two sides. What is important, because Horizon Europe will begin on the 1st of January next year, the calls are likely to be launched already before the end of this year, at least in anticipation, if previous experience is any indication. I think that it will be important that, based on the principle of there is no agreement until everything is agreed, that negotiations do begin on an association agreement while the general negotiations take part. I think that this is something that it is achievable, and with due pressure on the parties, it is something that it would be important to get started, so that when there is a general agreement in place, hopefully before the end of the year, then immediately the specific association agreement to Horizon Europe can enter into force very rapidly.
Thanks very much, Paul. I could just perhaps answer you and the previous question very briefly to say we have had purely informal contacts with officials on both sides of the channel, and the report will be presented both to the Commission and other EU institutions and to the British authorities. Through these informal contacts, I have gathered, but cannot put my hand in the fire to swear, that the first calls under Horizon Europe will not be before the end of the year, but actually will be quite late in 2021. I've been speaking with officials directly concerned in the last few days who have told me that this is likely to be the case, but I can't swear to that independently. That being said, I'd like to give the floor now for a maximum of 2 minutes to each of our panelists to sum up. You've had a number of questions. Please feel free to answer whichever of them you choose. The floor is first yours, Jaroslav.
Thank you very much. I think because there are no British audience anymore, at least there's a smaller one, I can take a bigger risk and to say a bit more what I really think about it. And, you know, this is a political process. And you've got political will if you've got a constituencies pressing for it. So you've got universities, you've got research centers pressing for it, and they want to have a solution for it. However, politicians are under pressure from various sides. And it's a multiple aims that they have. For example, yesterday I have read that British business wants to have a crystal clear confirmation that the relationship with the third countries are still governed by the EU agreements. So they want to have a crystal clear that this is going to happen at least for this year. Well, there is a constituency, and the government is reacting to constituency. The researchers, research institutions are saying exactly the same. We have been benefiting from Horizon 2020. We want to benefit from a next one. But then politicians are under different pressures. And they've got also different aims in mind. They look not only at the research, but they look also at the importance and the competition between research centers. And then they would say, why money should go to British if they go to the Maltese or to Greek, not to say French, German. And as you know, German institutes were equally to British, more or less the same level of... and then you've got many other things, including if there is a research and there is a money, there is an outcome. Why not to have an outcome in Europe, 2027? Why we need to get engaged, and then especially if it's not very collaborative process. If there is a politics which is very ugly, then you think, well, maybe people, instead of learning English, could learn German, French, or some other languages. There are good universities in countries offering studies in these languages. So if you are going to, in an ugly area of non-cooperation,